Welcome to the All About You podcast. Today my guest is Tom, who is a self-confessed introvert. So we are diving into the world of introversion. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to start our conversation with the definition of introversion. Dictionary says, a quality of being shy and quiet and preferring to spend time alone rather than often being with other people. As an introvert, what are your thoughts about that?
It's half true. I think the definition of shy is sometimes always put towards introverts too, and it's not always the case. Like, introverts can be shy, and you can imagine an introvert sitting in the corner, ignoring other people or whatever, but it's not always the case. Like, often introverts can be sociable, but yeah, look, the rest of the definition is fairly spot on, preferring time to themselves, preferring time to regather their thoughts, regather their energy. So I think it's almost there, but I would say shy is only optional. It's not necessarily an introverted trait.
Now, I think this is a really interesting topic, and that's why I wanted you on the podcast to talk about this, because we often hear introvert, extrovert, and in theory, we sort of say, oh, I'm definitely an extrovert or I'm definitely an introvert. Those seem to be the only two options, but I don't think it's as cut and dried as that. We're going to explore that, but what I want to do first is to go back. Can you remember a time growing up when maybe you felt that, maybe I need a little bit more time for myself, or a little bit of a quiet lifestyle, so to speak?
Yeah, to use the word shy, I was incredibly shy growing up, to the point where, I would basically just be an outsider in most situations looking in. And it was even I was so shy, I had like one friend during my school years, and when he left school, the teacher had to say to me, like, Tom, are you going to be okay? Like, Matthew's going, are you going to be able to survive without him? So I was the definition of shy growing up. So really my shy roots go all the way back to the very beginning. But introversion, I think definitely, in my teenage years, I started to realize, okay, I do enjoy meeting people, but it's certainly taxing. And I definitely want some, me time, let's say, to recharge my batteries a little bit.
I think that's so true, because even in our adult life, we've got people who just give us energy and light, and we love being in their company. And other people, we just come away feeling drained and exhausted. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying not to use the word toxic, because I don't like that word anyway. But some people just seem to sort of sap the life out of you. Mm-hmm. Whether that's personality or whether that's their high energy.
Yeah, and for an introvert, at least I can speak for myself, it definitely takes a lot of energy for me in social situations, particularly because I think I do calculate many of the things I'm saying. So therefore, there's like a lot of calculation going on in my head when I'm talking, which takes energy, first of all. But add on to that the fact that I really dislike kind of fighting to have a conversation. Like, if you were cutting in a lot right now, if I had to keep fighting for my space, I'd probably just give up, because I don't like fighting for having a conversation. I also spoken to a lot of introverts, and quite often we're maybe a bit more sensitive, let's say. So therefore we pick up on a lot more signals. You can imagine how much data processing is going on for an introvert. And I think that's one of the reasons we kind of get so tired, in social situations, particularly, like you say, in really loud company. Like, there can be other situations, smaller groups, more thoughtful conversations, things like that, where maybe we don't get tired particularly quickly. Maybe we can last hours and hours and maybe even get energized from the situation. But yeah, I think that's the traits of an introvert, is that extra calculations going on and things like that, if that makes sense.
I think there's been a big shift since the pandemic. And I know we still talk about the pandemic, and now a lot of people are, particularly youngsters in school, are feeling the effects of not socialising with other people during the pandemic. But I think as an adult, a lot of people had room and space to breathe, because they were spending more time at home, they had a little bit more time. Out of that came this big movement of trying to sort of slow down a bit, whether it's called the slow living movement, which I think is gaining momentum, or just slowing down, not running at everything like a bull at a gate. I think that is becoming a thing now. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, the pandemic was a huge moment in our lives, right? Like a very recent big moment which had a lasting effect on everyone. And I think, you mentioned this trend. A trend that I've noticed since the pandemic is this, especially, the last year or two, is this movement towards in real life again. Like we had such a long time where we were completely isolated, and even after that it was like isolated but with masks or isolated in small groups. And I think now we're kind of prioritizing real life. You get more and more apps which are trying to get you off your phone and into real life. I think before we've spoken about the initiative, I forget the name of it now, like the No Phone Club or whatever. So, I think there's lots of initiatives like that. So I think it was just a very transformative time, the pandemic. And it brought a lot of change and, a lot of trauma too. I think some of this is a reaction to maybe some traumas we experienced during the pandemic. Like it was scary. We were alone, sometimes lonely. And I think, the consequence of that is change, big change.
I think there's a couple of points I want to cover there. I mean, first of all, across social media, I've seen a lot of these groups that are getting together, and you take your book, you take your journal, you take your sewing, your knitting, your colouring, your painting, whatever it is, and it's basically a phone-free zone. You can go on your own, do your own thing, but you're still with people, but it's a calming environment. And I'm seeing more and more of these springing up in major capitals of the world. Locally, there are groups doing this type of thing. That's a great idea, because we've got a growing number of single people, whether they are young people, whether they're middle-aged or slightly older. The single person group is growing. To have a safe place for people to go, meet other people, and it can be a relaxing environment. It hasn't always got to be a bar or something like that, because that would put a lot of people off, whether you're introvert, extrovert as well. A safe space for people to go along, meet other people, but it's a quiet environment. Because Tom, you have started up your own group, the Introverts group. Let's talk about how that started, what it is, and what it does and what it means to you.
My story is I moved to Valencia in 2021 in September. And, like everybody who moves to a new city, I tried different events out. I tried the language exchanges. I tried networking events. And quite honestly, I didn't like them. In fact, most of the time I kind of came away almost self-loathing. I'm too quiet. I'm too drained. I didn't like the whatever, just not enjoying myself at these events. And so fast forward 6 months, I was like, I want a smaller group. I want to meet people in a quieter environment. And so basically, I thought, let's see if other people might be interested. So I used Meetup. I created an event, Introvert Social Club, and I did an experiment. And, fast forward 2 years later, there's now nearly 1,600 people in the group, and clearly the experiment resonated. And to show you how it works, we get together. Usually I cap the limit at 15 people, so keeping it deliberately limited so it's not too overwhelming. You arrive and we kind of break into small groups of 2 or 3 usually, and you get about 25-30 minutes with each group, and we change groups 3 times during the night. And it's really just a kind of a place where it's a quiet environment, smaller groups. We have some conversation starters which are kind of more thoughtful, let's say, some deeper topics, some thoughtful questions. And it really is just trying to build this environment where it's good for introverts. It's safer, let's say, as well for introverts to come and connect. And it provides an opportunity, like I said earlier. Introverts aren't necessarily shy. In fact, many of us do want to meet new people, but there just aren't so many environments or places where we can comfortably do so. So I'm trying to build that environment so that people can meet each other here in Valencia, even as introverts.
Now, I've been to several of your events, and what I want to add in here is many, many years ago when I worked in corporate, I did the Myers-Briggs personality test, and I came out as an extrovert. I came along to your group. I thought your group was just fantastic, the way it was set up, the environment. But what struck me was the wide age group. I mean, there were some very young people there. I was at early 20s, people probably 30 to 40, plus some people 60, 65 plus. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really interesting, because I really expected to see a lot older age group. I didn't expect to see what I call the youngsters there at all.
Yeah, it's a real mix. Like it's like you said, we kind of span everyone from teens all the way up to, I think the oldest so far is about 70, I think. So, it's really a varied group, varied interests, varied nationalities. It's introversion, I guess, is something which goes beyond borders, beyond ages. It's something which everyone, oh, not everyone, but there can be people from anywhere and any age who are introverts and resonate with the group.
It was a very, very safe space you've created for people to walk in on their own. And I think that's very important, because when people move to another country, regardless of their age, walking into an event for the very first time alone takes a lot of courage, particularly if you're an introvert. That must be quite terrifying, I should imagine. What you have done, I think, is absolutely fantastic. You've created that environment, you've got this wide age group of people, and the questions are great. Some of the conversations I've had are just fantastic, because they are really, really good questions. So I think you work really, really hard on those questions. But we've been having several chats together about introversion, extroversion, and one thing for me that I've really realised thinking about this topic is, okay, I've been labelled as an extrovert. I can go to somewhere, and whether it's a restaurant or whether it's a fairly big event, I can have a great time, and then all of a sudden I feel a bit like Cinderella. I've got to go now. I've had a great time. I'm ready to go. There's been a lot of noise, people, lots of things going on, and it's like my cup is full.
Mm-hmm.
Before it overflows, I'm going to go. And I come home and I've had a really nice time, but it's nice to be home.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be introvert and extrovert in all of us in different degrees.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my understanding, it's often defined as a spectrum. And so I am on the spectrum more towards the introvert side, but there are definitely tendencies and times when I can come across quite extroverted and confident. And maybe we can talk about, what those type of environments are later. But, I think more commonly nowadays, you also hear of ambiverts, where it is very much somewhere in the centre, where you can be a bit of both depending on time, setting, environment. So that's, also a thing somewhere on the scale of introversion, extroversion. You can have ambiverts, which are like a little bit of both and kind of resonate with both ends of the spectrum.
What I want to talk about with you, though, Tom, is in your home environment, in theory, you can control what goes on to a certain extent. Let's talk about the workplace if you're introvert. How does that play out?
It can be difficult. Just thinking of my previous job, but there were times where we'd be in meetings, particularly virtually, where it's even more difficult to kind of, like I said earlier, quite often, for myself at least, I can be quite sensitive and attuned to what's going on and people's feelings and everything. And digitally, I think it's even more difficult to kind of to do that, because there's delays, there's lags, there's screen freezes or whatever. So I found it difficult, especially for a meeting full of, a lot of people, first of all, but particularly louder people, more charismatic people, more extroverted people. I found myself kind of, I wouldn't say pushed out, but I found myself feeling isolated because of my introverted nature, and I really had to fight against that, and it didn't come easy for me, to be honest with you. All I did was keep trying, but that was something I did feel I kind of got left out or held back a little bit from my introversion in the workplace.
I would imagine, in my mind, introverts are working at home in their, whether they've got an office at the kitchen table or in a cafe, they are working in their own little bubble. But it must be very difficult when, in theory, everything's online and you've got 30 other people on the screen, tiny little squares, and, you've got to fight for your space to have your say.
It is difficult. And like I said earlier, I don't like fighting. But also, you mentioned in the cafes or things, if we're working in an office, I get very distracted by noise. So for me, it's one of these things where I need to kind of be having headphones on, because otherwise I will get distracted by other conversations and things going on. So I think, I don't know if it's an introvert trait or a me trait, but I definitely find that if I am going to properly focus, I need to be in the zone. I often say to my girlfriend, if I'm working at home, I'm like, give me like half an hour in the zone. Like, don't interrupt me. I'm going to have my headphones on, because that's the only way I can do good work. Otherwise I do get very distracted by people being around. And I'm not sure where that comes from. Maybe it's just I'm attuned to people talking and sound and everything, but I can get very distracted. And
Can we talk about how you handle situations if you know you're going to be going to like a high stress environment, let's say a restaurant or a big group of people? How do you is prepare the right way for that, or plan, or do you have strategies?
I mean, first of all, probably try not to do much the few days before to kind of like let my social battery charge up anyway. I would try to find an individual or a few individuals to speak to. So rather than seeing it as a big group, kind of see it as a bunch of individuals. So if possible, let's say we're at a restaurant, and Spanish restaurants can be incredibly loud sometimes. I would, rather than try to, think about the entire table as people to connect with, or be like, my partners here and there, how can I connect with those? And really just kind of like see it as, less overwhelming and more just a bunch of individuals. Because, one-on-one, I'm not too bad at conversation. Small groups, I can do well. Big groups, I struggle a lot. So I'd say that. Also, taking time for myself. If I'm there and like, wow, I'm feeling overwhelmed, take a minute, go to the toilet, have a long toilet break where you're kind of just getting your spirit back, taking some time. And I've done that many times, like, taking a step away just to recalibrate, get my batteries back again. And then, afterwards, like you said earlier, when you feel like your cup is overflowing, when you're boiling over, knowing when it's time to leave as well. Like, that sometimes part of the sweet spot is like showing your face, being there as much as you can, and then leaving when it's time to go.
Social battery. I love that. I've just written that down. Your social battery. Protecting your social battery. Refilling your social battery. Because life can get a bit overwhelming sometimes. And I think I found as I've got a bit older, as much as I would have loved to go round the shops and see what's new, now I'm like, do I really have to go and buy some new bits and pieces for the winter, etc.? Whether that's an age thing, I don't know. I mean, we live in Valencia, a relatively big city. Times this social battery, I think that is brilliant. I love that. Yeah. How is your social battery? This idea of recharging. We've seen so many pictures, and we're just about to come into autumn, winter. We are going to see yet again pictures, particularly of women with their hands round a hot drink, a fluffy blanket, a big thick sweater and fluffy socks. Self-care. If I see one more, I'm going to scream. Because self-care for people, for somebody else, that's
Absolutely.
their idea of hell.
True.
They need other ways to self-charge.
And this is where you've got to listen to yourself, right? And so, I think in the past I've tried to do what other people do to kind of like, I've been to clubs a few times in the past because it was the thing to do, and I don't really enjoy clubs very much. I've done my fair share of not really knowing what I need and just going along with what everybody else needs. But I think at some point you just realise, okay, this isn't really working for me. And you kind of, for me, for example, if I am feeling overwhelmed or stressed, I need to spend some time at home. Maybe by myself even. Maybe even, I say to my girlfriend, hey, give me some time to myself. And that's kind of like, even she's okay with that. She's like, okay, yeah, he needs a bit of space or whatever. But yeah, no, sometimes, it sounds silly, but sometimes I just need to sit and think. And that sounds really weird, but sometimes that's all I need. Because sometimes my brain feels like there's so much going on. And it's almost like almost like a lake or something. Like if you keep just playing with a lake, the bubbles and ripples will keep going. And I just need a moment to stop and pause and let the ripples kind of die down. And that's when I can kind of think clearly again, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense, because I think sometimes we don't know where our own boundaries are. We've got this movement of you can do more, you can be more, you can earn more, you can get more. And then we seem to have the counter of that, as in, let's chill out, let's slow down, and let's work out what works for you. Knowing your boundaries is really, really important. And often we can look at our diary and go, oh my God, look at this is just crazy. And I'm guilty of this. I am so guilty. Because coming to your groups, having conversations with you about being an introvert, although in theory I'm an extrovert, it's really made me think for the first time about, do I class myself as an extrovert? What does introvert, extrovert mean to me? What are my boundaries? what gives me energy, what drains my energy. I mean, it's such a fascinating topic, knowing what works for you, and I guess that comes along from trial and error, knowing our boundaries.
I think there's a lot to be said for self-reflection in general. And I think you are a journaler, somebody who journals. I've also done the same for, 5 years or more now. And for me, that's been an incredibly useful habit. Partly because, just the nature of journaling is a chance to get your thoughts on a page, chance to reflect, let's say. But it comes with lots of other benefits too. Like, for example, I'll give an example of if I am struggling with something, self-doubt, self-loathing, whatever it might be. When you're doing it in your head, it's a spiral. It's just round and round and round and round. There's no end to it, right? But as soon as you put it on the paper, you've got a beginning and you've got an end. Otherwise, you just keep repeating. And you're like, well, I don't want to keep repeating what I've already written. So just putting stuff down on the paper really helps when it comes to journaling. And the other interesting habit I used to do, less nowadays, but I like to do it from time to time, is actually reflect over and read through what I've written before. So in fact, my birthday is coming up very soon, and what I did before a few times on my birthday was read an entire year's worth of journals. So you can imagine, like, day by day, recapping my entire year of thoughts, feelings, experiences, and that was eye-opening too. Like, you talk about, finding your own boundaries, reflecting about who you are, what your needs are, having that ability to reflect and closely reflect, your feelings, your deepest, darkest emotions sometimes. That in itself was very useful in kind of understanding me, what I need and who I am, I guess.
Like you, I absolutely love journaling, and I've done it for a long time. I always look at it as a bit like, as you say, getting stuff out of your head that's going round. Often you can make sense of it when you actually put it down on paper. And I think it's a bit like being your own therapist. This is how I'm feeling at the moment, and then why? Okay, so why am I feeling like that? Because of da-da-da. Well, why did that affect you? Da-da-da. And I just keep asking, peeling back the onion, asking the why.
Yeah.
And stuff comes out, and it just, because we try to keep so much in our head, we're very much in a technology environment now. We've got to remember PIN numbers and everything. It's just, let's get it all out and let's try and clear our brains a bit and put it down on paper. So I think the power of journaling. So I'm really glad you brought that up about journaling.
I also just like the return to analog. Again, nowadays I do it digitally, so I'm contradicting myself. But even there are certain problems which I have to solve with a pen and paper. Particularly brainstorming. I find brainstorming digitally incredibly difficult to do. I don't know what it is. I don't know, something about being restricted almost by like a digital page where it's like linear and it has a start and it's got an end. That for me doesn't feel like a place which is easy to brainstorm. For brainstorming, and again a little bit for journaling sometimes, I prefer analog, just a good old pen and paper. I don't know, I feel like I can go deeper maybe, or just think more clearly, let's say.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think there is scientific proof, and I'm sure I read about this, that you go deeper when it's brain, hand, pen, paper type connection. And for me, the way I look at it, on the computer is work related, pen in hand is like free time reflection. And there is nothing greater, I think, taking yourself to a park, a cafe, somewhere you're comfortable. The library to me is the best place on the planet. The library is great. With a notebook and a pen, and just writing what's going on, what's happened, what would you like to happen, and sitting in that environment, I think is just great. But yes, as you say, pen and paper as opposed to keyboard. To me, keyboard's work related, pen, paper is me, it's my time.
That clear distinction. I do lots of hobbies and stuff on the computer too, but I do agree, like there's certain things which I need to use a pen and paper for.
Let's talk about, this is a very, very big question, but what advice would you give for somebody who thinks, I'm not sure if I'm an introvert or extrovert, and I've done the Myers-Briggs, I came out as an extrovert, but I don't think it's as cut and dried as that. What would you say to somebody who's listening to this and thinking, Yeah, I sometimes feel a bit overwhelmed, and yeah, I really appreciate having time on my own or just the calming environment of home. What advice would you give to somebody who wants to explore more being an introvert?
I mean, you mentioned Myers-Briggs. It is a good place to start. And like you say, it's not, clear cut. And in fact, for some people it really resonates, and for some people it really doesn't. For me, I read my Myers-Briggs, I'm INFP, or the mediator if you use the 16 Personalities website. And for me, it was like reading my own journal. I was like, holy wow, this is amazing. Like, this is me who got inside my head. Whereas my girlfriend did the test twice, totally different both times, and for her neither description resonated. So it can resonate, it can't resonate, depends on who you are. I think also put your personality type. But yeah, tips for if you're an introvert, like we mentioned earlier, there are more and more kind of creative types of meetups going on nowadays, and it's no longer just a club or just a pub or whatever. There are lots of different meetups going on, depending where you are, of course. Explore. There's probably, if you're in a city, there's probably some kind of meetup which is for journaling. Maybe there's one for introverts. Maybe there is something better in small groups. I think that's a big thing for introverts. We don't like big groups. And so, think of something with small groups. Chess club, board games group. Also, we don't really like small talk as introverts necessarily. So having an activity to do, whether it's board games, chess, even something like tennis, although we're a bit too far from each other to have a good chat, but some kind of activity can be a really useful way to meet other people, to connect, but without the pressure of we've got to have small talk and da-da-da-da. And there are an increase of meetups talking deep talk. I see an increase of meetups about this as well, more about philosophical subjects and things of that nature. So keep an eye out for different events and things which are more suitable to you and your needs and tendencies.
I think that's a good point as well, because we have so much access to stuff on social media now. A lot of it is incredibly superficial. These groups, like your introversion group with deep questions, philosophy groups that are starting up, I think a lot of people are saying, okay, I need more than this. I really want to have a good conversation with somebody. So I've always subscribed to the thought, if what you want is not there, go out and create
Absolutely.
it. Because chances are, if you want that, somebody else will, and somebody's got to lead in and get it set up, because yours has been incredibly successful.
You're literally mirroring my story, right? I wanted this group, and I made it happen. And the benefit, especially for introverts, in doing something like this, it can feel scary, and perhaps it is scary to put something out there, to be the leader, let's say. But for me, at least, by doing that, by being the leader or the organizer, it comes with a certain role to play. You have a role to play, you have responsibilities, and that, for me at least, kind of it brings a certain confidence with it too. When I'm just Tom Norman, the event attendee, I'm definitely a lot more shy, kind of, or definitely a lot more apprehensive or holding myself back. Whereas if I'm Tom, the organizer, my responsibility is to organize. My responsibility, I've got permission to say hello to, permission to know the rules of how things work. So I think, if you're an introvert, if something like this doesn't exist, definitely can make it happen, because it does come with these extra benefits of, being, let's face it, being the most sought after person in the room, essentially. As the organizer, typically you are the one most people want to speak to. And if you're somebody who struggles to fight for, your voice to be heard, being the most sought after person in the room can really help.
You've just reminded me, I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with somebody, and we were talking about children, and we were talking about how children can feel a bit overwhelmed in a big group. And we were talking about the benefits of sort of drama with children. When they're playing the role of somebody else, they can feel more confident because they're not playing themselves. So that was a really good way of getting children involved in drama, theatre, or anything like that. And I thought that was just a genius idea.
It's not the only situation I've heard of either. A few people I know mentioned the fact that they're non-native English speakers, and so when they travel, they speak English, and that persona, travel them, is a more confident persona than them back in their home countries, let's say. And they said, the reason is when you're traveling, you can kind of leave expectations at home. Often you're doing, new things, you're kind of more proactive, you're talking to more people because you have to, especially if you're doing solo travel. So some people have told me actually they are more confident in English because the English them is associated with travel. And it's a similar thing, they've got a persona at home in their native language from the environment they've grown up in, the expectations they grew up with. But they've kind of let that go with the English speaking them, and I find that fascinating too. Their whole personality can change based on the language they're speaking.
I think that is an interesting point, isn't it, about travelling? You become this other person, yeah. Tom, any final thoughts? Any words of wisdom?
I mean, I would finish just by saying, sometimes being an introvert can be labelled as something negative. It shouldn't be, but that's sometimes how it is. He's an introvert. And you kind of use it as a negative label, but it really isn't. Yes, there are things, for me in the workplace, it held me back sometimes, okay? But that's one minor aspect of my life. It also brings so many positive traits. For example, being typically introverts are a little bit more thoughtful, both in the sense of maybe having deeper thoughts, let's say, because we prefer the deeper conversations. We spend more time to ourselves, which means more things going on in our heads. But quite often, I'm not saying it's only an introvert thing, but quite often more thoughtful about others too. We're so perceptive that we're noticing a lot more about others' feelings, their needs, often, but not always. We are more creative too, for the same reason, really. We kind of think things differently. We, again, get the time to ourselves to explore. So there are so many good things about being an introvert that it's not a negative thing. It's just a thing. Same with being an extrovert has positive traits, so does being an introvert. So it's not something to change. It's not something to remedy. It's something to understand, know where your strengths are, and really, live life from your strengths rather than play the cards where you're going to lose most of the time.
I think that is absolutely brilliant advice, because there were so many positives you listed there. I think that was absolutely fantastic. So we've talked about how successful your introvert group. So just before we finish, let's talk about it. Where can people find you? And what I particularly want to encourage is, if people are not living in Valencia, them starting their own group. So what do they need to do, and how should they go about
Absolutely.
it, Tom?
So the website would be introverts-social.club. That's where you can find all the information about Introvert Social Club. And really, I'm like you said, I'm looking to expand it. I can only do so much as I can in Valencia. It's been an incredible experience for many reasons, like we've discussed already. So if you are interested in hosting in cities beyond Valencia, reach out to me. You can find my contact details on the website. And I can support you in any way to in any way, within reasonable support of creating your own events in different cities as well. So definitely hit me up.
Because I think this needs to be available everywhere. Because even if you're not an introvert, I think you would enjoy those groups, because the conversations I had were just brilliant. The people I met were fascinating. The environment you have set up, you're very welcoming. You help people. Nobody has to fear walking in as an introvert. You'll be looked after and welcome. So let's get more people running these groups. Let's go for world domination.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate the kind words. And if anybody does want to host a group somewhere, definitely let me know.
Yep. So we'll put all the contact details for Tom about the group, where you can contact Tom. And maybe after these conversations, you fancy setting up your own group. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, please contact me on allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com, and let's tell your story.